France in the 17th century is the richest, most powerful nation in Europe. It will be overtaken, at least as a colonial power, by England in the 18th century, but not yet. The army is strong, the navy is strong. It is the center of Western European developments in terms of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, many of which work in France. It's highly influential in fashions, art, and clothes. The elites throughout Europe speak the language. But it is also characterized by a growing economic crisis, which is made even more difficult by the traditional political and social system in place, which is the ancient regime, or the ancien regime. Perhaps the best way to talk about France in the 17th, 18th century is by talking about the three kings that are governed during 150 years. So it starts with Louis XIII, who isn't on this slide, and continues with Louis XIV, who has an extraordinarily long reign. During his reigns, he will pursue anti-Protestant policies, some of which are rather brutal, and will make sure that France essentially is a Catholic, exclusively Catholic country. And he will build Versailles, and he will not be a particularly beloved king. I found a quote that says that at his death, every subject of the king experienced a profound sense of relief. He will govern for more than 70 years. The last 30 years of his reign are almost entirely war years, and even before that he's engaged in lots of wars. Louis XIV is succeeded by another Bourbon king, by Louis XV, who will also govern quite long, namely for 50 years. He's highly unpopular, and the only thing he is really interested in is hunting deer and deer, as one of my books put it. So he's going hunting and womanizing. He is in charge during the 7 Years' War, in which France loses much of its colonial territory to the British Empire, including much of North America. And when he dies, another textbook says that French people shed few tears at his passing. Louis XV got to enjoy Versailles to a great extent. Louis XVI is the one who paid for Versailles in many ways. He is married to Marie Antoinette, which was not a happy union, and even today you can read about theories of what happened during the first 5 to 7 years of their marriage. It's pretty interesting that we still explore these things. He supports the colonies, the 13 colonies in North America, with money, arms, and expertise, and French soldiers in the French Navy. This will be hugely expensive. And under his watch, the French Revolution will start, and that will cost him his life. So in 1793, he will be executed, and then his wife, Marie Antoinette, will be executed a little later. I found this nice site which says that Versailles is the story of 4 men named Louis. Louis XIII bought it, Louis XIV built it, Louis XV enjoyed it, and Louis XVI paid for it. That's all you really need to know to understand the French Revolution. While I disagree that that's all you have to understand, and it tells you a lot. Versailles really is the symbol of French society. It's hugely expensive, and it is a system that is unsustainable and will enable the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, during the French Revolution, we see the emergence of the French Republic, of the First French Republic, which will then be ended by a dictatorship of sorts by Napoleon, who then will crown himself as the new emperor and will reign from 1799 until 1814 and 15. And during those 15 years, he will conquer and occupy much of Western Europe. After Napoleon, there will be another Louis. We'll see after the Congress of Vienna what's called the Bourbon Restoration. So another Bourbon king will be on the throne in France, and that is Louis XVIII. So I can't blame you if you think there's lots of Louis, as this cartoon also shows. I want to discuss the background or context that the French Revolution was embedded in, and these include absolutism, the Ancien Regime, poor harvests, and the Enlightenment. And then I want to talk about some triggers that pretty directly contributed to the French Revolution. These are the bankruptcy of the French state, the famine, and then the States General. In the 17th century, Europe sees two different types of monarchies. The very rare type is the constitutional monarchy that developed in England through the English Civil War and then the Glorious Revolution from 1688-89 with the Bill of Rights. The more common type of monarchy is the absolute monarchy, which we see in France, Spain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and other places. And in these absolutist monarchies, the monarchical power is fairly unrestrained by any other institutions, such as legislators or a parliament. They exist in some countries, but they are not powerful in any meaningful way. And the monarch rules by divine rights, which has a whole lot of consequences, because God gave monarch the monarchy, so the power is given by God. Nobody can question God. No one can question the monarchy, therefore. So questioning the monarchy would be blasphemy, because it means questioning God. And one excellent example of an absolute monarch is Louis XIV, who is a king from the House of Bourbons and reigns for 72 years. He is also known as Louis the Great, or the Sun King, and he's famous for saying, "L'État c'est moi," the state is me, and he's famous for building Versailles. The Palace of Versailles, which you see here, is a royal chateau in Versailles, which is a little bit outside of France, which used to be where the French kings, starting with Louis XIV, were residing most of the time. Today it is open as a museum, and you should go and visit if you're going to Paris. It's a huge and luxurious palace that impresses visitors until this day. And here is the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. This becomes an interesting location. Historically, what will happen in the next 150 years, France and emerging Germany will fight several wars, starting with the 1870-1871 Franco-Prussian War, which Prussia wins, and that is the final step in unifying Germany, and so the German Empire gets declared within the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Then World War I, which is the second war between the two countries, Germany will be signing the Treaty of Versailles in Versailles, and then during World War II, when initially Germany is successful in occupying France, again, treaties will be signed in Versailles. So it's become this big place of humiliation between those two countries. Versailles was very famous. It is this symbol of power and absolutism, and it immediately was serving as an example for other monarchs. So here on the top you see Versailles, on the bottom you see the Peterhof Palace, which is called also the Russian Versailles, which is near St. Petersburg, built by Peter the Great in 1715 or so. Here's another example, one that I like personally. This is, again, on the top, the Palace of Versailles, and on the bottom, 200 years later, a crazy king in Bavaria, King Ludwig II, builds the palace on the bottom, Herrenchiemsee, which is near Munich, where I grew up. And so you can see it's the same building, essentially, in a little smaller. Ludwig II, the Bavarian king, was an interesting character. He is famous for several buildings, not only Herrenchiemsee here at the bottom, but also Neuschwanstein Castle, which is the top right castle here. It actually exists. And then he also built the Festspielhaus for performing Wagner's operas. It still exists, it's in Bayreuth, and it's this hugely problematic location because Wagner is this hugely problematic composer, and we'll hear more about him in due time. So the left was first, the castle was first. Disney copied the castle, not the other way around. Louis XIV, besides building Versailles, makes war and activity of the state. So rather than having private armies, he reorganizes the military with himself at the very top. He dramatically increases the troop size. He fights lots of wars. Many of them are very costly. In fact, the last 30 years or so of his reign are almost continuous war. He also tries to strengthen and concentrate the country administratively. He is not particularly successful in doing this. He is also known for his ruthless religious repression of Protestants, or the Huguenots, whom he persecutes. They're either forced to convert, or they have to flee, or they get killed. And he makes Protestantism essentially illegal, so France is a Catholic country to this day. Here are some of the major wars of Louis XIV. Let me just mention the War of the Spanish Succession between 1702 and 1713, so during the final years of his reign. So what happens in the War of the Spanish Succession is that the Habsburg line in Spain gets extinct, and the next follower for the Spanish throne would be Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, who inherits the Spanish throne, and this would be uniting the French and the Spanish crown and the two kingdoms under a single monarch. And that makes other major powers in Europe very nervous, and they put together an anti-French coalition to avert this, from their point of view, undesirable scenario, and manage to win that war. And in the peace settlement, France and Spain are forbidden from ever uniting these two thrones under one. France also loses significant territory. And all of this is expensive. So Louis XIV, the 15th, and the 16th, they need money because they have huge expenses, because they have these lofty lifestyles with these enormous palaces and so on and so forth. They have huge military enterprises and wars, and France is suffering from a very weak and unjust taxation system where only the underprivileged classes, peasants and the middle classes, paid direct taxes. Essentially, the crown was unable or unwilling to tax wealthy people, and the entire tax burden is borne out by the bottom of the society. And so we have a system of taxation that is not progressive, but regressive. So it takes money from poor people and it gives money to rich people. And that's an outrageously unjust system. The Ancien Regime is the system in place in many European countries in the 18th century. it essentially classifies people into privileged people and unprivileged people. And in the French case, the privileged people are the ones that pay no taxes and are treated well, while the unprivileged people pay all of the taxes and are treated badly and have no rights. So in France in particular, society is divided into 3 estates. The first and second estate are the privileged people or classes, and the third estate is everybody else, and these are the unprivileged people or the unprivileged class. The first estate is the high-ranking members, consists of the high-ranking members of the church. The second estate is the nobility. And the third estate is essentially everybody else, not just peasants, but mainly peasants, but also more or less wealthy middle-class bourgeoisie merchants in the city. So really, the 3 estates are the clergy, the church, the nobility, the monarchy, and everyone else. And here are some data on the size of these estates. The population, the third estate is 98% of the population, and the first and second estate together are the 1 or 2% of society. They own much larger shares of the land than what their size is, and they pay none of the taxes. So the taxation, which you see here in the third pie, is borne to 100% by the third estate. This caricature from the 18th century is very revealing in terms of the system in place. You see a peasant being crushed by the burden of carrying the nobility and clergy on its back, symbolizing the heavy taxation that peasants, or the third estate more generally, had to the benefit of the other 2 estates. You also see rabbits and doves in the back. These are animals eating the peasants' harvests or grains. These were protected animals so that the other estates could basically, so that the upper classes basically could hunt them. And those same laws that would make these animals protected allowed aristocratic hunting parties to follow the chase of these animals even if they trampled and devastated the peasants' fields. Here's an example of the 1%ers, Marie Antoinette, who became a symbol of the waste and luxury of the royals, of the French royals at this time. She was born in 1755 in Austria, in Vienna. She is married to Louis XVI at a very early age. They have a unhappy and unsuccessful marriage, at least initially. At least that's what people speculate. And she gets executed in 1793 during the French Revolution. And she was famous for her lavish spending habits. She's called Madame Deficit. She supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," when the famine made wheat unaffordable or bread unaffordable for peasants, although that's probably not a quote that she ever uttered. This brings me to the third point or context of the French Revolution, which are poor harvests and high taxation. France's economy is primarily based on agriculture at the time, and peasants are paying most of the taxes. This was a time, however, that saw poor harvests for a variety of reasons. This is partially due to the cold winters that were brought by the Little Ice Age, and it's also there's a hailstorm destroying much of the harvest in the year before the revolution or in the year of the revolution. So these poor harvests make it difficult for peasants to pay their regular taxes, and it made it impossible for them to essentially have the taxes raised. And if you look here at the price of wheat, you see there clearly is a increase in the last years before the revolution, which breaks out here in 1789. The taxation burden that farmers were facing is shown in this figure, which covers the year 1600 through the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. And the blue line, this blue line, shows the number of days you had to work in order to pay your taxes. And as you can see, there's a clear upward trend. There's also some spikes. So during the Spanish Succession War, we see a spike here. The 7-Year War is interesting and influential. And then the American Revolution is also interesting because France finances the revolution. And so the American Revolution has two impacts on the French Revolution. One is a financial impact, and the other one is a philosophical impact. This brings me to the Enlightenment philosophers as a context in which the French Revolution happens. The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason is this time period where philosophers and intellectuals began to ask if natural laws might also apply to human beings. So we have philosophers that question the existing order, they question religion, they use reason and logic rather than faith, religion and superstition to answer important questions. They are trying to find laws, and they are trying to find natural laws, but also laws of how governments should be organized and formed. And so they're looking for rational principles to make governments better. And very quickly they conclude that the divine rights of kings are probably not a good form of government, and so they come up with other suggestions, such as the separation of powers with Montesquieu and other ideas. These ideas play an important role in the American Revolution from 1765 to 83, which is the political upheaval of the 13 American colonies on the East Coast that want no taxation without representation and want to gain independence from Great Britain, which they will eventually gain. The American Revolution plays an important role for the French Revolution from a financial point of view, because the French heavily spent on the American Revolution, and they supported it financially and with troops, both soldiers and navy. So the French spent about 1.3 billion livres on war costs related to the American Revolution, and at the end of the war they have an accumulated 3.3 billion livres in debt, which is an enormous amount of money. And so that debt caused some of the upheavals that we see before and during the French Revolution, and led to economic and then social and political instability and change in France. So arguably, the French Revolution is caused by the American Revolution, if you want to look at it this way. This gets me to the actual triggers of the French Revolution, which first and foremost is bankruptcy of the French state. They're running out of money. So all the Louis kings, 14th, 15th, 16th, spend a lot of money. The 16th lavishes a lot of money on himself and his residences. Marie Antoinette is a very wasteful spender, at least it's perceived as such. And we have these huge war expenses and the financing of the American Revolution. And so the French government is simply running out of money. And what the king is trying to do is, the king and his ministers, finance minister in particular, tries to explore or propose to tax the nobility, and they won't accept that. And so the French taxation burden just goes up and up and up. Some of these spikes here, the War of the Spanish Succession, we've seen before, and then the 7-Year War, which is an interesting war for a variety of reasons, because it shifts the colonial power from France to England. So this is the 7 Years' War, which you may know as the French and Indian War. It involves most of Europe, and it is about who gets to govern which colonies, and essentially England wins this war and France loses much of its territory in Northern America. And this happens during Louis XV, and you have to understand the support of the American Revolution by France under Louis XVI. So up here, this spending, from the background of this humiliation, essentially. So France wanted to get back at England, and so the American Revolution is against England, and so France chips in some money. Here is the same figure, but showing actual tax revenue and expenditures, and you see first, everything's going up, more expenditure, more revenue, and secondly, there's a gap between the two lines. So you have higher expenditure than revenue, and that means you have an increasing debt burden. Another trigger of the French Revolution is a famine that happens. It's the worst famine in memory. So you have hungry and impoverished peasants who are fearing that the first two estates are going to increase their taxes even more, and so we see attacks on nobles throughout the country starting in 1789. And as a result of this need to reorganize the finances, the French king, Louis XVI, summons the Estates General, which is when things really get rolling. So the Estates General is the legislative assembly of the three estates, so the first estate, second estate, and the third estate. It is a parliament of sorts, but the last time it met before 1789 was 1614. It has no true powers, unlike Parliament in England. It's simply advisory to the board of the king. And it was summoned by Louis XVI to sort out government finances. When they meet, and they meet starting May 5th on 1789, they immediately start debating on how they should vote. And traditionally, the way the voting system worked in this Estates General was that each estate had one vote. And so this is a form of huge malapportionment, right? Because the first estate gets one vote and represents about 130,000 citizens. The second estate also gets one vote and represents 110,000 citizens or so. And the third estate also gets one vote, but represents 25 million people. So this is not only hugely imbalanced or malapportioned, it also means that essentially the first and the second estate always have a majority, screwing potentially the majority of the population. And so the third estate says, we don't want to vote as blocks. We want to have our votes counted proportional to the population that we represent. And that becomes a bitter debate between the three estates. And eventually, the third estate walks out and declares itself to be the National Assembly. The king responds to the declaration to be the National Assembly by locking the Third Estate out of the meeting. They relocate to a nearby tennis court where they take the famous tennis court oath. In that oath, they promise to not give up until France has a constitution. The king actually caves in and orders that the three estates meet again, and that the vote will now be actually proportional to population. Here's a famous painting by Jacques-Louis David about the tennis court oath. Here you can read the actual tennis court oath, the key content being that they will not dissolve until there will be a constitution. The king accepts the National Assembly as a new player. However, rumors spread that he has also plans to violently dissolve the National Assembly, and that then will lead to the storm of the Bastille, which is the beginning of the French Revolution. The French Revolution can be separated into 4 phases. The first 2 are relatively civilized. The second 2, especially the third one, are very bloody. Let's start with the National Assembly stage. The king is not too excited about giving up power, and when rumors spread that he might use military force to dissolve the National Assembly, people in Paris storm the Bastille, which is a prison that also stores weapons. And it happens on July 14th, 1789. And it's such an important event that until this day, July 14 is the French National Day. The National Assembly changes things immediately. There are reforms. They abolish guilds and labor unions. They abolish special privileges of the church, of the Second Estate as well. They force out many nobles out of France. They emigrate, and they're called émigrés. They hash out a constitution. They come up with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. They established equality before the law, at least for men. They reform local governments, and they start reforming the tax system. So many of the grievances that led to the French Revolution are being addressed under the National Assembly. The Declaration of the Rights of Man is an important document that ranks up there with, say, the Bill of Rights or the Independence Declaration of the United States. You can read it, it's very brief. I just highlight a few articles here. Article 1 says that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Article 2 says that there are rights of liberty, private property. Then Article 6 says that people are equal before the law. Article 7 says no arrest without judicial order. And then Articles 10 and 11 are about freedom of religion and speech. So in many ways, a typical Enlightenment program right there. The constitution that is being developed and adopted in 1791 has some democratic features. So the idea is that France remains a monarchy, but that the king really becomes the head of state. All laws are being created by the Legislative Assembly. Feudalism should be abolished. There are, however, undemocratic features. Voting is limited to taxpayers. Offices can only go to property owners. The new constitution ushers in the second phase of the French Revolution, which is the Legislative Assembly. During the Legislative Assembly, one important event is the capture of the royal family that is trying to escape from Paris to Austria. They want to reach Austria because Marie Antoinette, the wife of Louis XVI, is the sister of the Austrian emperor, and so Austria is a safe haven for them. They get caught and captured, and the entire revolution slowly evolves into a civil war with complicated groups and frontiers. Many nobles are fleeing. Some of them are actually revolutionaries themselves. Some of them flee and live abroad as emigres, and they're trying to get a coalition together to fight the revolution and reestablish the old regime. The church is not revolutionary because the church has its land seized and its rights and privileges taken, and so you have at least some peasants that are Catholics, devout Catholics, supportive of the church and therefore against the revolution. And so you have these different interests represented in France. We have then parties that represent these different interests, among them, for example, the Girondists and the Jacobins. The third phase of the French Revolution is the Convention, which establishes the first French Republic. And here the revolution really becomes an open civil war. One policy of the convention is to abolish the monarchy, and the thinking was that as long as the royal family lives, monarchy could be restored, and therefore the plan was to kill the family, and so they did. Louis XVI was executed in 1793. So was his wife, Marie Antoinette. Their daughter was allowed to go to Vienna because there could not be a female successor to the throne. However, their son, Louis Charles, who would be Louis XVII, was beaten and mistreated until he died in prison. Danton and his Jacobin political party become hegemonic and dominate the French internal domestic politics. They established the Committee of Public Safety, and the Reign of Terror begins. This is essentially a committee that accuses people of treason and then executes them. So estimates vary, but probably about 15,000 people died on the guillotine, which gets called the National Razor. Actually, Danton himself gets executed by the same means. While all of this is going on internally and you have essentially a civil war raging, France is also fighting external wars, and it does so very successfully. France faces opposition from a lot of countries, from Austria, England, Holland, Prussia, Spain, and some others. And France fights these countries by drafting Frenchmen into an army, into a French army. It's a very successful army, and France wins many of these battles. And one person that emerges as a very capable general during this time is Napoleon. You see him here crossing the Alps. This is yet another picture by Jacques-Louis David, or painting by Jacques-Louis David. This map shows you the enlargement of France during the Revolutionary Wars from 1789 to 1999. Here in orange you have the frontiers before the revolution, and then in green at the end of the revolution, and then areas that are set up or controlled by France. So France is growing. The final phase of the French Revolution is characterized by the Directory, which is the French revolutionary government set up by the Constitution of the year 3. They started recounting years after the First Republic, so that's the year 1795. It lasts for 4 years, It is a very inefficient form of government. It's highly corrupt, and so people get frustrated with it. And it gets eventually overthrown by a coup d'etat, which brings Napoleon Bonaparte, who is a general, to power, first together with others, but then pretty quickly he becomes essentially the dictator of France. And that ends the French Revolution. So people say the French Revolution ends in 1799 with that coup d'etat. And what follows is the First French Empire under Napoleon. So Napoleon will become emperor in 1804 and remain that for 10 years. And during those 10 years, France will greatly expand. Just to preview, the First French Empire under Napoleon becomes larger and larger, and in 1812, when it is at its biggest extent, it either directly or indirectly governs over most of Western Europe, with the exception of England, who is the main country on the other side of this conflict. Let me close by recommending a documentary about Jacques-Louis David, this interesting, important, and controversial painter I mentioned before. The documentary is part of Simon Schama's Power of Art series, about which you can find out more at this link here. It's a BBC series. And you will find that particular documentary if you look for it on YouTube. So Jacques-Louis David created many famous paintings, including those.